Welcome back. On this video, we will continue our review of joint classification. So in our last activity, you were looking at the synovial joint parts. And you would have ended up with a diagram that looks a little like this. Or like this. Remember, this is a general model, so a typical synovial joint does not necessarily include all these parts, but it is useful for us as we review the material. And synovial joints can be also classified further based on the movements that they allow. Let's have a look at those. Plane joint is sometimes known as a gliding joint. In these ones, the bones that articulate are simply just gliding on top of each other. And the intercarpal joints, which we see here, are a good example of this. Others could include intertarsal joints of the ankle and joints between vertebral articular surfaces. The next one is hinge joint. Here it's like a door hinge, right? So some good examples could be the elbow joints and also joints between the phalanges. And if you think about it, these allow nicely the flexion and extension. I want to talk next about the pivot joint. Here we have one end that holds still while another part of this end rotates. And this would allow rotation with proximal radio-ulnar joints being a good example, as well as atlantoaxial joint of the first and second cervical vertebrae could do. Let's have a look at the condylar joint. There is like an oval socket, but note that it is not quite like a ball and socket fit yet. So these would allow a range of movements: flexion, extension, adduction, abduction. As examples, think of the metacarpophalangeal joints. These are our knuckles. Or a wrist joint is another good one. Now let's look at the saddle joint. It sits and fits very well, but does not allow unlimited movement. So we are left with biaxial movement on two axes. And therefore, adduction and abduction, as well as flexion and extension, are possible. As examples, here we have used the carpometacarpal joints of the thumbs. Finally, here we have a proper ball and socket joint. And on these, there is a great fit and a huge amount of movement possible. So flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation too. Think of our shoulder joints and hip joints. So multi-axial movement for sure. So that completes our review of structural classification of joints. Now I want to talk about functional classification. And there are really fancy words involved with this. But just remember that these simply describe how much that joint moves. A good example of immovable ones would be our skull bones that we discussed earlier. And then for the slightly movable ones, think of ribs. To allow for breathing, some amount of movement is needed, but at the same time, a level of rigidity is needed to protect everything inside. And finally, the freely movable joints. Think of a shoulder joint or a hip. Both of these have a large range of movement possible. And your textbook offers a great set of tables to review many joints in your body. And these can be classified as we have discussed before. You are going to study independently the knee joint and shoulder joint, as well as elbow, hip, and the TM. This is temporomandibular joints. Finally, do not forget to review the osteoarthritis as one clinical example to know. So that's it for this week. Thank you for joining me.